There is a moment in every empath's life that no one sees coming. It doesn't look loud, it doesn't look dramatic, there is no warning siren, just silence, followed by a very specific kind of emotional absence. And that is the moment a fed-up empath changes. Not breaks, not cries, not pleads, changes. Because for a long time, the empath has been trained by the world to survive in one way: absorb, tolerate, understand, forgive, explain away, and keep giving even when it hurts. They become the emotional shelter for people who never learned how to regulate their own darkness. And that is exactly why nobody notices the shift. Because everyone is used to the empath being available, predictable, soft in the same places, understanding even when they shouldn't be. But here is what no one tells you. The empath is not weak. The empath is restrained. And restraint has a limit. Because every empath reaches a point where their nervous system stops negotiating with chaos, where their emotional intelligence stops translating cruelty into maybe they had a bad day, where their compassion stops being a doorway for repeated damage. And in that moment, something dangerous happens. They don't explode, they don't beg, they don't explain anymore. They withdraw their attention. And if you understand psychology at even a surface level, you know this. Attention is currency. Emotional availability is leverage. Understanding is fuel for toxic systems. And when an empath removes all three at once, the entire dynamic collapses. Not loudly, quietly, like oxygen being removed from a room you didn't realize you were breathing in. This is the part that gets misunderstood. Because the narcissist, whether conscious or unconscious, has built their entire relational world around predictable emotional reactions. There is a shift that almost no one notices when it begins inside an empath, because it doesn't announce itself with anger or confrontation or visible rebellion. It begins in silence, in small internal recalibrations that happen after repeated emotional exhaustion, after countless moments of understanding people who never tried to understand them back, after absorbing moods that were never theirs to carry, after explaining themselves to people who were never truly listening, and slowly, something in their nervous system starts to change its rules about what deserves a reaction, what deserves attention, what deserves emotional energy, and what deserves absolutely nothing at all. And this is where unpredictability is born, not as a strategy, not as manipulation, but as a survival outcome of a mind that has finally started to recognize patterns instead of participating in them blindly. The empath used to be predictable because they were operating from compassion that was automatic, almost reflexive, like a conditioned response to emotional disturbance in others. Someone hurts, they step in. Someone withdraws, they chase clarity. Someone becomes cold, they try to warm the situation. And over time, this creates a system where their emotional presence becomes a resource others can anticipate and rely on regardless of how they behave. But when that same empath reaches saturation, something subtle but irreversible happens. The reflex doesn't fire the same way anymore. There is a pause where there used to be immediate response. There is evaluation where there used to be instant reaction. There is silence where there used to be emotional filling of space. And this silence is not emptiness, it is recalibration. In that recalibration, the empath begins to register something new. Not just what people are saying, but the pattern behind what they are doing. The repetition behind the emotional cycles. The predictability behind the unpredictability that others try to create. And this awareness slowly disrupts the automatic nature of their empathy. Because empathy without boundaries is emotional exposure. And once exposure has been experienced enough times, the nervous system begins to prioritize protection over participation. And protection does not respond on schedule. Protection waits, observes, and chooses. This is where the emotional unpredictability starts to become visible to others, but misunderstood by them, because people who are used to a consistent emotional output from the empath begin to experience gaps, delays, or complete absence of expected reactions. And in those gaps, they try harder to provoke the old response. They increase intensity, they repeat patterns, they escalate emotional signals, not realizing that escalation no longer guarantees engagement, because the empath is no longer operating inside the same emotional contract. The fed-up empath no longer treats every emotional signal as urgent. They no longer interpret discomfort in others as a personal responsibility to resolve immediately. They begin to distinguish between what is genuine emotional expression and what is behavioral conditioning designed to trigger compliance. And that distinction changes everything about how they respond, because now response is not automatic, it is conditional, and conditions require observation, not reaction. So when someone expects the old empath to step in, to soften, to explain, to absorb tension, to restore balance, they sometimes get nothing, or they get delayed neutrality that does not match the emotional intensity being projected at them. And this mismatch is where control begins to fail, because control depends on timing, and timing depends on predictability. And predictability has now been disrupted at a fundamental level. The empath is still capable of deep feeling, but feeling is no longer translated into immediate action. There is a buffer now, a psychological space between stimulus and response. And in that space, the empath is no longer being pulled into emotional storms without consent. They are watching the storm form, recognizing its shape, remembering its previous cycles, and deciding whether it deserves entry or not. And often the decision is no. This creates confusion in people who were used to a certain emotional economy, where the empath's attention was always available, where their concern was always immediate, where their understanding was always unconditional. And now that economy is disrupted, there is scarcity where there used to be abundance, and scarcity always feels like loss to those who were overusing the resource. And because human behavior often escalates when reinforcement is removed, the initial reaction to this unpredictability is not understanding, but testing. Repeated attempts to trigger the old response, subtle provocations, emotional hooks, guilt-based language, urgency framing, withdrawal tactics, anything that once worked. But what they encounter now is inconsistency in outcome. Sometimes the empath responds, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they engage, sometimes they remain completely detached. And this variability itself becomes the new barrier. What they don't realize is that the empath is no longer operating from emotional obligation. They are operating from pattern recognition. And pattern recognition does not require participation. It requires observation over time. And in that observation, the empath begins to see that many emotional interactions were never about connection. They were about regulation. One person regulating themselves through another person's empathy. And once that realization stabilizes, the automatic response collapses further. Now unpredictability becomes the new baseline, not because the empath is trying to be difficult, but because they are no longer emotionally synchronized with other people's expectations. They are synchronized with internal assessment. And internal assessment does not prioritize external comfort over internal stability. So reactions slow down, soften, or disappear, depending on whether engagement is necessary or simply habitual. This is where the shift becomes dangerous in perception, because unpredictability removes leverage. And when leverage is removed, influence weakens. And when influence weakens, frustration rises in those who depended on it. And that frustration often gets misinterpreted as the empath becoming colder or more distant. But in reality, they are simply no longer responding to emotional pressure as if it is a command. They begin to recognize that not every emotional display requires intervention. Not every silence requires pursuit. Not every discomfort requires resolution through them. And this recognition creates space between them and the emotional chaos that once defined their relationships. And in that space, they regain something they had lost long ago: internal authority over their own attention. Attention becomes selective, and selectivity creates unpredictability, because now there is no guaranteed pattern of response, no reliable emotional sequence others can depend on, only awareness that the empath may or may not engage, depending on what is actually happening beneath the surface, not what is being projected on top of it. And this is what fundamentally changes the dynamic, because once someone cannot predict your emotional availability, they cannot structure their behavior around controlling it. And once that structure collapses, the empath is no longer operating as an emotional resource that can be triggered on demand. They are operating as an independent system that responds only to what aligns with their internal clarity. What most people never understand about an empath is that their empathy was never the problem. It was the lack of boundaries around it. Because empathy in its natural state is not weakness. it is perception. It is the ability to feel patterns in people before those people even fully reveal themselves. But when that perception is used without discrimination, it becomes an open system that absorbs everything: truth, distortion, pain, manipulation, sincerity, and emotional projection all enter through the same door. And over time, that constant, unfiltered intake begins to overwhelm the nervous system. Not emotionally at first, but structurally. Because the mind starts losing the ability to separate what belongs to self and what belongs to others. And in that blurred space, the empath becomes available to everyone, but unavailable to themselves. The turning point begins when repetition makes recognition unavoidable. The empath starts to notice that not all emotional signals are equal, that some expressions of vulnerability are consistent patterns used to regain access, that some forms of sadness appear only when accountability is near, that some apologies are cycles rather than change. And this recognition does not immediately shut down empathy. Instead, it begins to interrupt its automatic distribution, because the mind now has data where before it only had reaction. And data changes behavior without needing emotional justification. This is where empathy stops being unconditional and starts becoming selective. Not because the empath becomes less compassionate, but because they become more aware of the cost of misdirected compassion. They begin to realize that giving understanding to someone who repeatedly misuses it does not create healing. It reinforces behavior. And reinforcing behavior that causes harm to the empath eventually turns empathy into self-neglect disguised as kindness. So the shift happens internally first. The empath starts to hesitate before offering emotional access. They begin to pause before explaining themselves excessively. They begin to question whether their understanding is being met with accountability or simply being consumed. And in that questioning, something fundamental changes. Empathy is no longer an automatic response. It becomes a conscious allocation of energy. And when something becomes conscious, it becomes controlled. This is where reallocation happens, not the disappearance of empathy, but its redirection. Because the empath does not lose the ability to care, they lose the willingness to care blindly. And that distinction is critical, because caring blindly is what kept them trapped in cycles where their emotional depth was used as stability for people who had no intention of stabilizing themselves. They begin to notice that every time they extend empathy without boundaries, it is not just received, it is often absorbed and repurposed, sometimes into justification, sometimes into avoidance of accountability, sometimes into repetition of the same behavior under a different emotional disguise. And this realization creates a quiet but irreversible internal shift, where empathy is no longer distributed evenly across all emotional displays. It becomes filtered through experience, pattern, and consequence. At this stage, the empath starts to develop a new internal mechanism, a kind of emotional triage, where every situation is unconsciously evaluated for authenticity, consistency, and responsibility before emotional investment is given. And if those elements are missing, empathy does not disappear, it simply does not activate in the same way. It becomes observational rather than participatory. This is what confuses people who were dependent on the empath's openness, because they expect the same emotional availability regardless of behavior. They expect understanding to be given automatically, even in the absence of change. But now understanding is no longer free access. It is conditional on evidence of sincerity. And this conditional structure feels unfamiliar to those who are used to unrestricted emotional entry. And when emotional access becomes restricted, reactions follow predictable patterns. Some increase emotional intensity, trying to force the old response through pressure. Others withdraw, hoping absence will restore the previous dynamic. Others oscillate between guilt and frustration, attempting to regain influence through emotional triggers that once worked. But what they encounter is no longer the same system, because the empath is no longer operating from reflex, they are operating from evaluation. The key change is that empathy is no longer confused with obligation, and this separation is what stabilizes the empath internally, because obligation is what kept them in cycles of over-giving, over-explaining, over-forgiving, and over-engaging, often at the cost of their own emotional coherence. But once obligation is removed from empathy, the empath can still understand people deeply without being pulled into their instability. This is not emotional detachment, it is emotional precision, where understanding someone does not automatically translate into participating in their chaos, where recognizing pain does not require absorbing it, where seeing someone's pattern does not require becoming part of it. And this precision is what transforms the empath from an open system into a selective one. And selective systems are no longer predictable to those who relied on them being open, because now emotional access is not guaranteed, it is earned through consistency, not intensity. And this is where the disruption becomes most visible, because intensity used to be enough to trigger engagement, but now it is not. And when intensity stops working, those who depended on it begin to escalate confusion rather than adjust behavior. What they fail to realize is that the empath is no longer responding to emotional performance. They are responding to behavioral evidence over time. And once that shift occurs, empathy becomes something that cannot be manipulated through momentary displays. Because it is no longer triggered by immediate emotional input, it is filtered through accumulated pattern recognition. This creates a silent restructuring of relationships, where the empath is still capable of deep care, but only in environments that demonstrate stability, accountability, and emotional integrity. And outside of those environments, empathy remains present but inactive in its former form, no longer spilling into systems that misuse it. And this is what makes the shift so powerful. Not the loss of empathy, but its containment. Because once empathy is contained, it stops being a vulnerability and becomes a tool of discernment. And discernment changes everything about how the empath moves through emotional space. They no longer enter every emotional situation as a participant. They enter as an observer who decides whether participation is even necessary. There is a point in the evolution of an empath where everything they once confused with love, responsibility, and emotional duty begins to collapse into something much simpler and much more uncomfortable for the people around them: clarity. Not the emotional kind that comforts, not the hopeful kind that excuses, but the kind that strips away noise until only behavior is visible. And when that level of clarity activates, the empath stops participating in emotional illusions and starts perceiving systems as they actually function rather than how they are presented. This shift does not begin with confrontation. It begins with observation, because the empath has spent so long inside emotional environments where meaning was constantly distorted by words that did not match actions, apologies that did not match patterns, and vulnerability that was strategically timed, that eventually the mind begins to prioritize consistency over expression. And when consistency becomes the filter, emotional manipulation loses its disguise. At this stage, the empath is no longer asking, "What does this person feel?" They are asking, "What does this person repeatedly do?" And that shift alone changes everything. Because feelings are variable, but behavior forms structure, and structure reveals truth over time. And once the empath starts trusting structure over language, emotional influence begins to weaken significantly. This is where emotional participation starts to dissolve. Not because the empath becomes indifferent, but because they become accurate. And accuracy removes the need for emotional distortion. They no longer need to soften reality in order to tolerate it. They no longer need to explain away inconsistencies in order to maintain connection. They no longer need to imagine potential over pattern, because pattern is now visible without interference. And when pattern becomes visible, excuses lose their function, because excuses only operate in the absence of clarity. They require ambiguity to survive. They require emotional confusion to maintain influence. But the empath is no longer operating inside confusion. They are operating inside recognition. And recognition does not require agreement. It simply identifies repetition. This is where emotional withdrawal becomes complete, not as an act of punishment, but as an act of alignment. Because once clarity is established, participation in distortion becomes internally incompatible. The empath cannot simultaneously see behavior clearly and pretend not to see it in order to maintain emotional comfort, and that incompatibility naturally leads to disengagement. What makes this shift so difficult for others to interpret is that it is not loud. There is no dramatic ending, no emotional explosion, no need for closure through conflict. Because clarity does not require confrontation to be complete. It only requires awareness. And once awareness is stable, interaction changes automatically without explanation. The empath begins to respond less to emotional urgency, because urgency is no longer interpreted as importance. They begin to distinguish between real accountability and emotional performance, between genuine change and temporary emotional intensity, between reflection and repetition disguised as regret. and this distinction removes them from cycles they once felt trapped inside. At this point, emotional manipulation stops producing the same results because manipulation relies on misalignment between perception and reality. But when perception is grounded in consistent behavioral observation, the gap required for manipulation to work begins to close. And when that gap closes, influence collapses without resistance. People who once depended on emotional access to the empath begin to experience a new kind of resistance. Not active resistance, but absence of engagement. And absence is far more difficult to control than reaction, because reaction still participates in the system, but absence removes the system entirely from operation. This is where many misunderstand the empath's transformation, because from the outside, it may look like distance, coldness, or emotional withdrawal. But internally, it is alignment, the removal of emotional participation from environments that no longer match internal truth. And that removal is not reactive, it is structural. The empath no longer needs to justify their clarity, because clarity does not require permission. It only requires recognition. And once recognition is stable, emotional arguments lose relevance, because arguments operate in emotional space, while clarity operates in structural space. And in structural space, patterns matter more than moments. Repetition matters more than intention, and behavior matters more than expression. So the empath begins to evaluate everything through continuity rather than intensity. And intensity without continuity becomes meaningless in decision-making. This is where emotional detachment is often misunderstood, because it is not a loss of feeling, it is the removal of distortion from feeling. The empath still perceives deeply, still understands complexity, still recognizes emotional nuance, but they no longer allow those perceptions to override consistent behavioral evidence. So instead of being pulled into cycles of explanation, they step out of them entirely. Instead of engaging in emotional negotiations that reset without change, they observe without re-entry. Instead of trying to resolve contradictions within others, they recognize contradictions as information. And once information replaces emotional obligation, the entire relational structure shifts. Because now the empath is no longer inside the emotional system trying to fix it. They are outside the system recognizing whether it is functional or not. This external position creates a level of psychological stability that was previously unavailable. Because the empath is no longer absorbing emotional chaos as if it is their responsibility to organize it. They are simply seeing it for what it is. Repeated behavior patterns with predictable outcomes. And predictability removes emotional shock, which removes emotional reactivity, which removes the fuel that manipulation relies on, leaving interactions neutralized unless genuine change is present. At this level, the empath no longer needs to prove anything, because proof is no longer sought through emotional debate, it is observed through time, and time always reveals consistency or lack of it without requiring interpretation. So when people attempt to reintroduce old emotional dynamics, they find that the empath no longer enters the same roles. They no longer stabilize instability. They no longer interpret confusion as complexity. They no longer translate inconsistency into potential, because clarity has already resolved those interpretations internally. And what remains is simple awareness that not everything deserves engagement, not every emotional signal deserves participation, not every connection deserves continuation, and not every history deserves repetition. This is the final restructuring, where emotional clarity becomes permanent orientation rather than temporary insight. And once that orientation stabilizes, the empath no longer returns to systems that require distortion in order to function, because clarity and distortion cannot coexist in the same level of participation.